I'm going to talk about personal finance. Some of you, if you're at the ACR conference, you got the majority of this talk this past year, but learning something more than once never hurt anybody. So you may or may not have sights on being a practice leader, department leader, section head, whatever that may be. And you may or may not care about finance. So my goal here is to convince you of two things. You have the skills to manage finance, both personal and professionally. And doing both is important for being both a good member of a practice or a department and for being a good owner or leader. And so the best thing about this, no matter what your proclivities are for math, is that there's almost no numbers really in finance. It's not about math, it's about psychology and behavior. And so that's why we're going to talk about how those things intersect. So we're going to talk about basic behavior finance concepts, the basics of savings and investing, and there's like at least one useful slide for giving you a roadmap here on where I think you should start. I'm going to point you to a few more resources that are good, and we're going to talk about how to avoid mistakes in decision making. That's apropos not just for personal finance, but for professional decisions as well, because you will be making them eventually. So this is one of my favorite quotes. Whether or not it's correctly attributable to Albert Einstein, that's up for debate if you look it up online, but it doesn't really matter. The point is you need to understand, and you need to understand explicitly. One, how you think, how we think, individually and together, and the tools that are available to us to help us through that. And so the goal here is to help your decisions, both personally and professionally, be better informed. And in that way, you'll be better equipped to succeed in what is a difficult environment. So we're going to start with behavioral finance. And so, there's no harm not necessarily being familiar with it, but it's a field of economics that explores how your internal thoughts and your internal thought processes influence your decisions. And it's mostly a study of predictable and systematic errors that people make. And these errors or biases lead to what's called the behavior gap. Now, the behavior gap is the difference between the returns that, say, the market gets, as in just the standard global stock market or any single company, and the returns that you, as an individual investor, might get, specifically what you get after taxes or fees. And there's a lot of things that lead to that behavior gap. Lack of humility, a certain measure of arrogance, and what we'll come back to in a little bit is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which some of you may be familiar with. But the message really is to let it go. So we're all competitive. You didn't get here without being competitive to a degree. But don't play a game that you're almost certainly going to lose. If you remember a movie from the 80s, the computer's conclusion of the nuclear crisis with the Russians was, strange game, best move is not to play. So don't play Wall Street games. You are going to lose. And even it's just like roulette or any other Vegas game, sometimes you might accidentally do something and succeed, quote, succeed. That could possibly be the worst thing for you because it reinforces a terrible decision. So best moves here, my recommendation is concentrate on what you can control. And what you can control includes what you save and what you spend. You cannot control what you earn in a market. You cannot control necessarily what your salary is now or in the future, and you cannot control large macro moves in healthcare, payment policy, economics, or the business cycle. That is outside of your control. Control what you can, what you save, what you spend, and how much it costs you to do those things. And that brings us specifically to costs. As I said, you cannot control investment returns, you cannot control the market, and you cannot control these larger trends, these macroscopic trends, both in the economy or your profession. So you can control how much it costs you to invest and the price that you pay for advice or guidance. I have no strong opinion on whether or not you use a financial advisor or other professional, but I do have a strong opinion that you shouldn't overpay for that individual, and the fact that I think most people can do it yourself. And we'll get into that. My goal is actually to finish this quick enough that we can get to questions in the limited time, since some people have finished quickly and I'm going to use all of their extra time. So examples of costs that you can control. There's fees with any expenses you have, whether you use certain vehicles like mutual funds, exchange traded funds, or buying individual stocks. There are fees associated with all of these things. Don't pay stupid fees. One of the things that I learned when I was first starting to read about this, and that being, like, I had a financial background, but personal finance is way different than corporate finance. When I first learned what a 12B1 fee is, and just in case you never delved into the real small print on like the retirement savings, details for your institutions or what you've done. A 12B1 fee is a fee that you pay a mutual fund for them to advertise that mutual fund to other people. So if you really think about that, if you ever see some product that you use on TV, you know who paid for that advertisement? You did. And that's what I have partners who don't understand, that when they come to RSNA and they go to a fancy dinner from a vendor that we use, you paid for that. At least pay a reasonable amount. That goes for taxes, that goes for assets under management fees for your financial advisors. A lot of this stuff is intentionally opaque because people don't do the extra step of finding out for it. So your first clue is you don't necessarily have to go in the small print. If somebody isn't crystal clear on what something costs, red flag. Ask the question, pause, or be like, you know what? They didn't make it easy to find out. I'm not using this product, because if it's not easy to find out, chances are they're figuring out how to screw you, because the arbitrage there is you won't take the effort to find out how much it costs. By the way, that works for the vendors too. By the way, there's a reason that they can pay for all these things. So there's a lot of different cognitive biases. Now, our goal here isn't necessarily to walk out of this with a PhD in psychology or economics and understand them, but a few of them are worth reviewing. So confirmation bias, anybody should be familiar with this if you have ever delved into politics. It is seeking information that is consistent with your beliefs. It is widespread. It is built into your brainstem. You do it without stopping in it because it makes you feel good. It's the dopamine. If you're aware that you do it, you can at least mitigate it by seeking out disconfirming evidence. And I'm specifically talking about investments. We're going to stay away from the politics. Anchoring is personally what I wrote my thesis on, and it is when you get stuck on irrelevant data. And so one of the examples we use, and what we used in a study, is you ask two different groups of people how many stairs you think there are in the Eiffel Tower. So just in your mind, think about it. Most people come up with a broad range of numbers, but if you take the 15th and 85th percentiles of that range, it usually ends up about 300 and about 1,800 stairs. Fine. So you go to two different groups of people and you ask, do you think there are more or less than 300 stairs in the Eiffel Tower? People are like, seems pretty tall, 300 is low, I'll say 600. Go to a totally separate group of people and say, do you think there are greater than or less than 1,800 stairs in the Eiffel Tower? They're like, it's pretty tall, but that's a lot of stairs, 1,500. And you can routinely bias these by giving people these, quote, irrelevant pieces of data. Fact, there aren't stairs all the way from the bottom to the top, so that's why you can ask the question, because there isn't a right answer. Differently, though, you can take a different group of people, spin a wheel so they know the number is random, use that number, and people will still statistically anchor on that number because your brain cannot and will not let it go. And I don't think you'll have to stretch very hard to find professional ways that matters. Patient histories, or lack thereof, will bias you. It's a short skip to pretest probability for how you assess an exam. Anchoring matters. Now, blind spot bias, another personal favorite of mine. Everybody else is subject to these fallacies, but not me. I'm smart, I'm educated, I'm a physician, I've gone to a lot of school. These other people make decision errors, but not me. Good luck with that. And then another one that's favorite of the AI crowd is the Ludic fallacy, as in the world can be predicted accurately with mathematical models. It cannot. You can approximate, you can guess, you can get close, you can get things that work in many circumstances, but they will not work in all of them, and they are less applicable than you would like. Don't listen to me, trust Taleb, he's broken it down pretty articulately for you if you want to judge through it. So the world's run by humans, by us and our reptilian brains. They're not always on our team. So don't just focus on the data, focus on the people behind the data, the decisions, and actually the behavior and the feelings associated with that data, and you'll do better. Concentrate on the people, not the models. And that brings us to the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the simplest way to think about Dunning-Kruger is you can be too stupid to know you're stupid. So the quote from David Dunning, one of the authors of the study, is, "The way that we traditionally conceive of ignorance as an absence of knowledge leads us to think of education as the natural antidote, but education can produce illusory confidence." So we're going to unpack that a little bit. Say you have and I'm not ready to go there yet. All right. Say you have a first-year resident. First day, they know nothing, or hopefully they do. By the end of the year, I would say, typically, the first years are probably a little overconfident. That's fine. Second and third year are meant to beat that confidence out of you, as many of you have experienced or are experiencing. And so fourth year in fellowship, I think you are getting on a solid footing with data, experience, you got numbers, so you can actually start to have reasonable disagreements with your attendings. And so you can start forming your own opinions. But you are never, ever as naively confident as you probably were June at the end of your first year. That's a little bit of Dunning-Kruger. We have a habit of developing irrational overconfidences, and that overwhelms, any evidence that happens to be floating around of our own ignorance. And that goes into one of those behavioral biases called the halo effect. So doctors, you have years of training, you are specialized, you are highly intelligent, you are better than a large portion of the population at your specialty, not at everything. And that everything is the arbitrage that finance people use to take advantage of you, because they are experts at finance and marketing. And have you ever talked to a salesperson and they bring something up and then let you strategically correct them and they're like, oh, that's a very good point. And then you feel good? Yeah, they won. So understand where you're good, understand where you're not, and be willing to not know and be uncomfortable and make people explain it to you. It is okay to be stupid. I play that game with Medicare all the time. Help me understand this payment policy. How does that work? I fully know what they have. I read the rules. I'm making them explain it to me because you're trying to put them on a footing and see where they are to give your advantage. Say, quiet, loud mind, quiet mouth. Let people have enough rope to show you what they're trying to do to you or how they're trying to manipulate you or what they're trying to shade from you. And it's not that people are dumb. I know I started by saying you can be too stupid to know you're stupid. And Richard Thaler, Nobel Prize economist, one of the people behind a lot of the research in the cognitive biases, he makes an excellent point. He's like, look, people aren't dumb. The world is hard. And your brain's not necessarily wired to help you out with these levels of complexity with the varying amount of bandwidth you have to deal with it. So yeah, there's a little bit of stupid. I assign the more pejorative stupid to if you're being willingly stupid, but recognize that this stuff is hard, so your job is to figure out how to get around your own stupid. And the question you need to answer is, how do I achieve my financial goals? And like many other things, like fitness, fashion, sports, boring and simple usually are a better formula for success than complex and expensive. So examples. If you want to get stronger, lift progressively heavy weights consistently. There's probably not supplements that are going to do it for you. It's not going to be the fancy clothes that you got from Lululemon, and it's not going to be the Orange Theory or CrossFit or whatever your 24-hour fitness gym of course is. You actually have to go do the work. It's simple and it's boring. That's how you get stronger. You want to play better in sports? It's probably not going to be your fancy golf clubs or your tennis racket or this fancy whatever that you bought and the magnetic bracelet that you have or the clothes you're wearing. It's probably going to be if you put in the work. It's simple and it's boring. The same thing works for finance. If you want to get wealthy, and this is not like, Warren Buffett wealthy or Scrooge McDuck wealthy. If you want to get wealthy, it's a choice. Wealthy is just the ability to cover your expenses by your savings. If you save, if you live below your means and you avoid lifestyle inflation, then you develop good habits, which are simple and boring and consistent, then you're going to achieve those goals. Boring and simple is much better than expensive and complex, at least for finance. I'm sure some of you can come up with an example of where, fancy and expensive and complex is better, but I'm going to go with simple and boring, hence my clothing decisions. So, and part of that is using the right tools. So it's intimidating to go through the financial jargon. Fine. But I absolutely rebut the stance that people take when I don't understand all these finance words. That's bullshit. You know how many words you learned first year of med school? It's like tens of thousands of words that you didn't know beforehand. There's only like 100 in finance. So I don't buy it. That's lazy. You can learn them. It ain't that hard. What's important though is these aren't just words. These are the tools that you're going to actually be using to achieve your goals. So if you understand the tools, then you can actually make them work for you as opposed to constantly being frustrated or confused by what you're looking at or what somebody's saying. And so retirement plans, your 401k, your 403b, I'm not defining all these for you. These are part of your compensation. When an employer or your group or your department anybody is offering these as your benefits package, no. That's what they're paying you. That's part of your salary. If you choose to leave money on the table, that's basically telling them, I'll work for less. Well, that's fine. You can do that, but don't complain about what you make because you just walked away from money. Some of it was free. If you make your participation automatic, this is about that decision making. You get busy, you're tired, you don't have bandwidth. Make decisions when you have the decision making bandwidth to make them, then automate them, and then walk away and don't mess with them. You made a good decision, why revisit it over and over again? So if you make those savings automatic, it removes all of those behavioral biases you're exposed to every time you try to make a decision. You know what the difference is between second and third year radiology residents and attendings? They don't have to make effortful decisions when they're interpreting the radiology studies because they've made that decision a bunch. It is automatic. It is a habit. It is simple and it's boring for them, and they can do it without effort, which is why they can read 50 studies to your 5, is because the decisions are already there. It's just plugging through, and they can do it with a lot less effort. You are earning that effort now, and you can earn it later. You sit down, you work on the finance stuff, you get your stuff set up, and then you walk away from it. You put an effortful decision in place and then walked away. Don't remake an effortful decision over and over again. It's not going to benefit you. You don't go through finances like you read radiology studies. So this is if you're going to take a picture of any slide, take a picture at the end of this slide, because this is from the White Coat Investor, which I highly recommend people go through and read if you haven't. It's whitecoatinvestor.com. ER physician Jim Dolly has broken down a lot of this stuff, has a podcast that's pretty solid as well, has a part of the webpage that's like, here, if you're new, start here. Highly recommend. It's unbiased, and he's pretty detailed about if he has any conflicts of interest, and he lays them out for you. But if you want a plan, and it's pretty simple. This is simple and boring, and we'll go through it. If you go and get a professional plan and you pay a financial advisor to do this stuff, it's going to look shockingly similar to this. And if it deviates much, you got to start asking some more questions. Clearly, invest up to, whether you're in a 403B, which would be a nonprofit organization, 401k if you're in a for-profit organization, retirement plan, up to the match. That match is your employer putting money in your account for you. That's part of your compensation. If you choose not to do that, that's just telling them you're willing to work for less money. So you go after free money first, then you pay off the easy money. Short-term, non-tax deductible debt, that'd really be credit cards or high interest rate, short-term student loans if you took a residency relocation loan, things like that. Student loans come next. I encourage you to that lifestyle inflation thing, live like a resident for a few more years, make all of your student loans go away as fast as possible. My wife's also a physician, but basically we had a house in residency, and as attendings, we moved into an apartment in technically a cheaper area to live, but all of that money just went to student loans to make them go away. I recommend everybody will have a different version because it's just your priorities. There's no one right way to do it. And then emergency fund plus minus. There's a lot of thoughts on emergency funds. We can break it down in questions. You can find me in the hall, but we're not going to break it down in here. Roth IRAs, if you make little enough money to go directly into Roth IRA, I highly recommend you do it. Otherwise, if you make over the IRS limit, you can do a backdoor Roth IRA. And you can look that up. There's more than one place that will walk you through it. Then maxing out the rest of your 401k, 403b as your pre-tax savings. If you think that only saving in your pre-tax accounts is enough, you're wrong. And then in HSA, you'll find more and more employers, even departments, about the only place that's not necessarily going to high deductible health plans is some of the academic centers because they're basically taking care of themselves. Even them are going to high deductible health plans. There's not an option in my group. There's 183 RADs. We have 70 non-physician employees in our group, so 250 people. We only have high deductible health plan as an option. So part of that is having an HSA, a health savings account. This is the only account on here that would be called triple tax-free. So you put money in a 401k, goes in there pre-tax. It'll grow tax-free, but when you pull it out, that counts as income. If you put money in an HSA, it goes in there pre-tax. It grows tax-free, and if you pull it out, according to the rules, and use it for health care, it comes out tax-free. So this is the only money you will basically never be taxed on ever is the money that gets washed through your HSA. And then you go start on your taxable brokerage accounts. It's nothing complicated. It's just it's an account that you'll own, mutual funds, ETFs, I don't recommend individual stocks, but you can own them. And then pay down the rest of your tax deductible debt, usually your mortgage. There's not a spot on here for car loans on purpose, by the way. Yeah, you're going to make them. Everybody does. You'd like to make them when they're small and when you don't have enough money to make monumentally stupid mistakes, or at least not expensive ones. Physicians have rightfully earned a stereotype or cliche for being pretty bad with finances or money in general. Now, the number one mistake physicians probably make is the lifestyle inflation. You've gone a long time with not a whole lot and you've accrued a fair amount of debt, and it's very tempting to immediately go out and inflate your expenses. I'm not going to tell you no, go have fun, YOLO and all that jazz, but if you think about compounding, everything that you don't spend that goes into savings now compounds over a pretty long time horizon and turns into a fair amount of money. So that $10,000, I just finished residency cruise, if you make it a $2,000 something, that $8,000 can become 6+ figures over a 40-year timeline. You can go crazy with that kind of thinking, by the way, and not buy a couch, because people have, but there's something called financial independence, retire early, or the FIRE community. If you see my Twitter profile, it's on there. Careful, some of those people will live like monks. You just take it with a grain of salt. So lifestyle inflation, and then the other big mistake that the physicians will make is I make a lot of money, therefore somehow the price I need to pay for investing or my financial advisor needs to correspondingly be high, which is exactly the opposite. You are an absolute target. If you ever wander into a forum of insurance salesmen or other financial people, they do not respect you, but they will make you feel good about yourselves when they talk to you face to face. They do not say nice things to you or about you behind your back, because you're a target. You're the one funding their retirement accounts. When they're able to take advantage of your information arbitrage, which is what we're trying to alleviate here today. Now, on the business side, one of the things doctors tend to not be well versed in is not only compounding, but a lot of the corporate finance issues. And so you get into not recognizing the risk that goes in leverage or having a lot of debt. You have gotten comfortable with using student loans and may have, 6 figures. We did 6 figures when you come out. Businesses aren't necessarily as resilient as you are, and you're only going to discharge that debt in death, and businesses can die too, and they will die slowly and painfully and quite expensively. And then misunderstanding the importance of some of these business relationships and who's actually on your team. And I'm referencing the vendors, financial advisors, or others. So in the lack of information, those people are less likely, you may employ them or you may use their services, but they may not be on your team. Another recommendation I have, you're going to walk away from 2 things besides that step-by-step financial plan, is the concept of inversion. It's just a mental model for problem solving, and encourage you to look at it backwards. Sorry, that is highly sensitive. So for radiology, instead of asking why is this mass in the liver a focal nodular hyperplasia, ask why it's not. In business, if you're sitting there trying to think of why my group or why my department, how can we be more innovative? Well, reverse it or invert the question. It's like, what are we doing that keeps us from being innovative? That question, that inverted question, is usually easier to answer. So for personal finance, instead of answering the question, how can I save enough to become financially independent, ask the question, what am I doing, will do, or have done that's going to keep me from meeting my financial goals? That's an easier question to answer. And so inverting the problem is not necessarily going to help you solve it, but it's really designed to help you avoid trouble, or you can think of it as the avoiding stupidity filter. And so my next favorite quote here is from Shane Parrish of Farnham Street. It's spend less time trying to be brilliant and more time trying to avoid obvious stupidity, because avoiding stupidity is easier than seeking brilliance. It's risk mitigation and management. Don't go and try to hit the home run, hit a series of base hits, and you will be better off than 90+% of people. Accepting market returns and paying as little for it as possible will keep you ahead of 80 to 85% of all other investors after fees and taxes. You know what? I don't need to be the Warren Buffett or the number one earner in investments. If I can be 85% of people, I'm okay with that. And then the best thing, and this is a lesson from Ray Dalio, who's a famous investor, you learn most things by making mistakes, including radiology. I mean, what do you think case conferences are or hot seat conferences? You learn by making mistakes and having your attendings correct them. Well, it sucks to make mistakes in finance because it costs you money. But you know who's made mistakes for you is all the other physicians that came before you. And so learn from their mistakes. The pain in this equation doesn't have to be yours. All that you're required to do is think about it. And you can avoid the mistakes for others. A lot of these things are tempting, they're tantalizing, they get the dopamine going in your brain. Recognize where the faults are, look at it, try not to commit financially to some of these traps, I would say, and you can avoid a lot, and then you make progress, and most of that progress will be pain-free. Maybe you just had a little bit of patience, maybe it was a delay, but you're avoiding the bigger parts of the pain. And this is the same for business decisions in your department, in your group. You know, look at the history of the prior decisions made by other companies, both inside and outside of healthcare. We have a bad habit in healthcare of only looking inside healthcare for examples. Looking outside healthcare at other businesses is very, very powerful. When healthcare was like, what do we do with millennials? You know who's been dealing with them for 8 years? Everybody else. But we get these blinders on and we don't think about it. The same thing with business. I'm not here to throw anybody under the bus, but there are historical aggregation, corporatization efforts that have taken place in healthcare that look shockingly similar to what's happened now. And does anybody know the company Ficor or Health South or any of these? You know why? Because they don't exist anymore. We've done this dance before. History lessons will keep you out of trouble. One of my radiology attendings always said, more history and prior exams makes you smarter. So it works the same in business and finance. So walking away, what habits can you get out of this? The small habits make really big impacts. And so personally, commit to savings and automation. Make the good decisions when you have the bandwidth, automate them, and you can walk away and be happy about it. Don't continue to try to make decisions over and over again because you don't have the bandwidth, and then you bring every one of those fun biases we talked about into play. Professionally, there's little habits that you can make that make you more valuable and indispensable. I'll give you an example. Anytime you're making a diagnosis, there's certain things that we're supposed to call as critical results. If you're making an important diagnosis for a primary care physician or an ER physician, like a cancer, give them a phone call. Say, hey, I just wanted you to know about this. I didn't want to sit, and did you have any questions for me about recommendations? One, they appreciate it. Two, you're establishing a relationship, and you're going to be the one that they want to go talk to again. Don't underestimate the importance of your reputation and your relationships in radiology. You may be in the dark room, but that phone is your link to a lot of business on the other end. And not all of your colleagues are going to see that. Now, there's a lot of tools that you can use. We talked about some of those, the accounts that we're referring to, the 401k, IRA, HSA. Those are your personal tools. That's how you're going to achieve the financial goals you want. Professionally, you need to know about some of the other financial tools, even the ones that your department uses. And you can go start learning about these now. You can learn about them later. It's not a rush, but you do need to know about them. You know, if you want something from your department chair and you don't understand the levers of finance that need to be pulled to get that, then they're probably not going to have a lot of patience with you. Participate in the decision making. And same thing in private practice. You got to understand, what's the compromise? What am I giving up to get this? What is the cost of debt? What debt instruments do I have available to me? What is the equity rules for this group that I'm joining? All of these are just tools in how to achieve certain ends. And if you don't understand them, they're going to be used against you, not for you. And then control. Spend time on what you can control. Don't spend a lot of time fretting about or suffering with things you can't control. So you cannot control the returns on the market. I'd recommend you don't even look at them. You can control how much you save, what you spend, and how much it costs you to do that. Professionally, you cannot control macro payment policy. You may be getting paid more or less from Medicare. We have very little, and you're talking to somebody who's supposed to be in charge of doing that for the ACR, we have some degree of influence over that. It is not monumental, and in general, unless you're sitting on our committee or supporting the ACR, you have zero say in it. Don't stress about it. Control what you can control. You can control how well you're interpreting exams, how you're helping patients, how you're interacting with your clinicians. That'll be way more important than whether Medicare is paying you plus or minus 1% on your RVUs this year. And we can talk about all this stuff, but unless you've sat down and thought about having a plan, it really is tough to guide behavior. And trust me, when I was in your seats and people said something about having a plan, I'd just roll my eyes and be like, oh, fuck off. It matters. What matters is when you lay it out, when you have time to think about it, it will help you, one, make decisions, but two, avoid bad ones. People talk about investor policy statements or whatever, but like you don't need some formal document, though you can. If you're one of those people that needs to like put it up on the wall so you don't do something stupid, do it. That's pretty easy. That costs nothing. Mine's just in a spreadsheet because I wasn't even willing to type it out in Word. But you can refer to it and it'll keep you on track because you're not going to have time every day or randomly, like when you're dealing with the kids and you have to go to RSNA and you're doing this other stuff and you're like, oh crap, I haven't looked and done this stuff. That's exactly when you're subject to every bias because you don't have any bandwidth to deal with it. Don't. Or at least if you are, refer to something or guidelines that you've set for yourself when you had the bandwidth to do it, so at least you can step back and you're like, you know what, it's not important that I do this right now, or stick with the rules that you've set for yourself. That works the same for professional. I gave a talk earlier about how my group does RVUs. Recognize that how your department, your groups do policy, those plans, policies or plans, that policy reflects your values. And it's pretty easy for people to go awry because they think they need to do something or they think they need rules or they're trying to address some micro behavior with some macro policy. Those policies are important. It communicates, one, what leadership thinks is important, but it communicates parts of the culture of the group or the department. So policy matters. And it's really annoying and it sucks to get into the nitty-gritty of it. But if you have a department or a practice that's designing policies that seem odd or at odds with how you would like to practice or they're creating feelings in your group that you think are negative, that's something to pay attention to. So you can either choose to confront it or maybe choose to exit the situation. The avoiding mistakes comes down to your Hippocratic Oath. Avoid or first do no harm. That includes to yourself. Pay yourself first. That's that automated savings. And then professionally, everybody's made these mistakes, learn from them. Don't repeat it. Then on the bias front, we know these biases are there, and we've also got great research that shows that even the people that are aware of all the biases are subject to the biases. It's not automatic. You're not just magically freed from not being subject to the confirmation bias because you know it's there. That dopamine's coming into your brain whether you recognize that there's a bias or not, then it's going to influence your behavior. It's just like knowing farm reps influence your behavior doesn't keep them from influencing your behavior. There's great data on that too. Best thing you can do is know that you're prone to being stupid, Dunning-Kruger, know that you don't know everything, halo effect, and then try to make those decisions when you have the bandwidth and have them vetted by others. And that's the same thing with your group decisions. Avoiding groupthink, that's that psychological phenomenon that, like, when you get a group together and they desire conformity or harmony, and so they don't sit there and say, hey, that policy we're about to pass is really stupid, we probably shouldn't do that. Like, I've literally been appointed to the CSC and the ACR to be the one to call BS on stuff. Diplomatically, but to call BS. That's kind of how I serve on the medical exec committee at our hospital, pointing out, say, when they have 16 groups in the hospital working on all these policies to get people discharged faster, to decrease length of stay, and it all hinges off of one data cell in Epic that less than 20% of the patients have filled in. Guys, this ain't gonna work. You can do that for your groups and for yourselves. Be the one that's willing to point it out and recognize when you're prone to error, like groupthink. So I'll leave you with one last thing, and it's what I started with. Finance is not math. Finance is behavior. So you can marshal and master your own behaviors. Once you understand this, it's way easier to get through it. And with that, I appreciate you guys inviting me for the time. I put my watch away, but according to my calculations, we have like 10 plus minutes for questions because everybody else talked too fast.
Hi, thank you for a excellent talk. My name is Jason Hartman. I'm a resident from University of Washington in Seattle, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on trying to purchase a home as a millennial, which is obviously quite a challenge. In particular, the use of very low down payment, quote unquote, physician loans.
Yeah, the zero, or you got a lot of different options there. You can go zero down payment, plus or minus being exposed to private mortgage insurance. You can go like the 10-10-10 route and taking loans for your 10 or 20% down. It comes down to your personal finance situations and also the cost of living area you're in and what the apartment or other options are. And so I struggle with that. That is an optimized spreadsheet in my mind, and you have to look at what the values are for you. So, and the other thing I'll say, finance, not math, there's a mathematical component to that, and you can work out what some of those numbers are and what it will cost you. But then what it comes down to is once you know that number, how do you feel about that number? Am I willing to pay for that number? Is the psychological benefit of having a house for me or my spouse or having my kids in this school district worth that number for me? That, to me, is the question to answer, not whether it's mathematically optimal. We make a lot of non-mathematically optimal decisions because not everything is numbers. It's how you feel about it. It's the behavior component. But you'd like to know what that number is so you know what you're giving up. Because it's going to cost, so it's going to have a negative component to it. You're going to have negative equity. You're going to pay an additional interest expense. You're going to have, and by the way, there was recently an article on this on one of the finance blogs that I follow, but it's like people still tragically underestimate what it actually costs to own a house. Whether it's property taxes, whether it's upkeep, do you have a new house or an old house? Those old houses are going to require stuff, and it's not all anticipatable. So when it's 20 degrees outside and the heat goes out, you're kind of out of options. So people think of these things as low percentage things, and they're not, because there's 100 things that can break, and they may all only have a 2% chance, but that actually means statistically, on a reasonable interval, more than one of them is going to break at a time. And so an estimate that you should put in your calculations is the cost of having a house can be 2 to 3% of the cost of that house per year. And that has nothing to do with the mortgage or the taxes. That has everything to do with all of the other stuff that goes into a house. So when you're putting that number in, and when we run financial projections and other stuff, you get into those fudge factors, those unanticipated costs. How close are you to being house poor, or how close are you to being on the financial edge? And this is like the debt service that some companies don't consider. We can pay this debt service where we borrowed $1 billion. It costs X per year to have borrowed that $1 billion. Operationally, what happens if our revenues decrease 7% because Medicare revalued E&M services? It's a non-anticipatable event. It's going to impact radiology services. And if you notice this for some of the corporate groups, their immediate bond ratings went down when two things happened. One, Medicare says they're revaluing E&Ms, which is going to impact professional reimbursement in the 7 to 8% range, as in negatively, in case you're keeping track. And two, the surprise billing legislation. So those two events caused corporate debt ratings to go from bad to junk because their anticipated revenues decreased. It's the same thing for you. There are unanticipatable costs with owning a house, but you can estimate them 2 to 3% range and put it in there. Find out what will keep you in your I'm okay the range to, ooh, if anything happens, we're screwed. You'd like to avoid that mistake. Sorry, that was a whole lot to get around to probably not a good idea. All right, I've been told that I should stop talking.
You're fine. I just wanted to, we still have about 10 minutes for questions, but I know Dr. Wolfman had to run, but Dr. Davenport and Dr. Brown are still here as well. So if you have questions for any of the speakers, feel free to ask them now.
No. Ask for forgiveness, not for permission. Apparently, I just took it on myself to take questions.
I'm Sean Woe, a fellow from the University of Washington. Can you maybe elaborate a little more about the revaluation of E&M codes?
Sure.
And when you're talking about like corporate debt going bad, are we talking about like Rad Partners, major corporations maybe?
I am not saying any names.
Okay.
So all that's Googleable, by the way, because they're rated by the debt services. All corporate debt is rated, even private corporate debt. So E&M services. So it can be agreed upon that most people feel primary care is underpaid. Fine. Was primary care's most common billable service? We're a little far afield from personal finance here, but I do payment policy nerddom as it is. So we'll have a quick refresher for you, and you can go educate your faculty. So primary care is paid mostly on office-based E&Ms. All right, these are office-based. So if your hospital owns a primary care or other specialty group, those E&Ms are not under the office-based fee schedule, they're under HOPS, which is a different fee schedule. So we're talking about Medicare physician fee schedule, office-based E&Ms, got a significant RVU bump. Great. Well, the Medicare budget is fixed. That's where you get things like budget neutrality. And the way you achieve budget neutrality in the RVU world is what's called the conversion factor. So as in one of my slides, it's $ equals RVUs times conversion factor. That's how you go from RVUs to money. RVUs being the relative value units and how we value healthcare services. So RVUs for those E&M codes, the evaluation and management codes, goes up. Fine. The thing is, when a radiology RVU goes up, like say we created MRI fetus. It's a new code, didn't exist before. It's 3 RVUs. That's a lot of RVUs in a single code. Do you know how much it's billed in the Medicare population? It's not. So it doesn't affect anything because it doesn't affect budget neutrality for the other codes. But even if it did, it's billed very seldomly, and so its effect would be on the thousandths or tenths of thousandths of a percent. E&M codes are over half of the fee schedule of the actual claims made for codes. So when you change the value of E&M codes, you significantly shift the pool of money in that fixed pool. So the only way to make that stuff work is to change the conversion factor, and the conversion factor has to go down. So the conversion factor this year is $36.09, or proposed for 2020. So 2021 is when those E&M codes will hit, and the expected conversion factor impact is in the negative 8 to 11% range. And that's pretty significant. 10% reduction takes a 30, so a 1 RVU study right now pays $36. A 1 RVU study in 2021 may pay $33. That's a big hit for people who primarily bill CPT-based RVU codes, like radiology, like pathology, and others. And so what happens, though, is that conversion, so the E&M code prices, RVUs went up, but the conversion factor went down. So actually the net gain for those codes for family medicine or internal medicine or whomever is actually only in the 1 to 2% range. But just since they're over half of the fee schedule, to get them that 1 to 2% bump means everybody else got a minus 3 to 11% in how their codes are done. And then there's the reason that's a range of negatives is because there's a lot of different policy levers that happen. There's an add-on code and we don't know how much it's going to be used. Do they put those E&M codes in those global surgery codes? The 10 and 90-day codes have office visits built into them, 2, 3, 6. Do they take all of those office codes and give them a bump on proportion to what the other office-based E&M codes did? That's what I'm referencing by E&M going down. So it's like my radiology group, we're large, it's 180 plus docs, it'll be more than that soon, but we don't own technical. We're a professional fee-only group. So we run lean. And so when you have decreases like that, it's not just Medicare. So the reason this is really important is not just because you have a decrease on your Medicare patients. All of your other private insurers' contracts, for the most part, for all intents and purposes, we'll say all, are based on the conversion factor. They're just usually based on a multiple or a fraction. It could be 1.1, 1.5, 2, depends on where you are in the country, what your negotiation leverage is, what have you. But since they're tied to Medicare's conversion factor, and they're usually tied to the updated conversion factor, when the conversion factor goes down by 8%, your private payer rates went down by 8% too. And so private payers aren't necessarily going to come to the negotiating table when you want to renegotiate back to what the standard is because they just saved a bunch of money too. And we know that those CEOs need their 10, 20, 30, $40 million packages. And so they just got a big bonus. And the medical loss ratio there is probably not going to cover that up very much because they have accounting shenanigans to take care of that. So it's a big deal. And if anybody has heard the words DRA, Deficit Reduction Act, or stuff that happened in the 2000s, that was that first time that radiology got hit with a huge technical decrease. That was on the order of like $1 billion that came out of radiology. We're talking about on the order of about 3. Is the next change. Now, is that, moving heaven and earth for radiology? No, we're going to still be on the other side of it. Is it necessarily going to happen in the way that I've laid out? Maybe, maybe not. They can mitigate that because one of the levers we have to pull here is you go and explain to Congress, we get that you wanted to give primary care a raise. We actually support that, and we have gone to Congress and said this. The problem is, what you don't understand is the way that this works in a site-neutral way. Fine, you have a family practice that's billing 50% Medicare patients. Well, fine, they got a 1 to 2% bump on those 50%. But the other 50% of their patients are private payer patients based on the conversion factor, which just went down by 10%, so you actually just cost them money. Good job. So Medicare only cares about Medicare. They do not care about how their decisions influence private practice. Congress would. Congress is the one that could say, fine, it's budget neutral, increase the budget, family medicine, primary care actually gets a 10, 15% bump, and then specialists get either less negative or stay neutral, which is what we're arguing for. So we're not arguing for more money, we're just like, increase the amount of water in the pool and give the extra water to them. We're fine with that. But as it's right now, you're stealing from one part of the specialties to barely give or spread that water very thinly among all the other ones. So it's not actually accomplishing what they wanted to accomplish.
We have time for one more question.
Sure, hit it.
So first, thanks a lot. I think that was a very informative talk. I really appreciate it. My name is Jacob Ham, Chief Resident, University of Maryland. I have two questions, if that's okay. The first was about the white coat investor slide that you had. You had student loans and, or rather, he had student loans and the emergency fund on the same line. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that a little bit. I personally tend to think weight like the emergency fund a little higher, especially with an upcoming move for fellowship and job interviews and everything. And secondly, could you just talk briefly about your opinions on dollar cost averaging?
Sure. So we'll do dollar cost averaging because it's easier. So there's two answers to that. Like I implied earlier on the mortgage, there's a mathematical answer and there's a behavioral answer. So dollar cost averaging, what that is say you have a lump sum of money. Say you have $100,000 and you want to invest it. Do you invest all $100,000 at once, or over time, do you invest $10,000 every month for the next 10 months? The theory being that the market's going to go up and down, and if you invested $100,000 on day one, and then on day two the market went down, you would be pissed because you just lost money. As opposed to, you can mitigate some of that loss risk by putting it in a little bit at a time over time, the dollar cost averaging. That's what that is. So the mathematical answer is, it depends on your time horizon, but on almost all time horizons longer than 3 to 5 years, you're better off putting all the money in at once and walking away. Because time in the market will earn you returns, whether that's dividends, whether you put it in bonds and you're getting an interest rate coupon, or you have longer term on your gains for them to compound. So that's the mathematical answer. But if you personally are going to put that money in, and then in a month or two, then the market goes down. By the way, last December, the market went down like 20% in a week. I would encourage you not to have even known that fact, nor care about it. Because unless you needed money in January, you shouldn't have had it in investments that could lose 20%. And so that 20% shouldn't matter to you at all because you don't need your money for 40 years. So, but if you are one who knows that 2 months later, if you have a 20% decline in the market, you're going to be, and then pull that money out, that's when you lost money. Technically, when you put $100,000 in and you lose 20%, it's at $80,000, that's what's called a paper loss. It doesn't exist until you cash it out. But then once you cash it out, that loss is fixed. Now, to get back to $100,000, you've got to actually, you lost 20%, but to get to $100,000, you've got to earn 125% on that money to get it back to $100,000. So, if you can just let it ride, putting it all in at once is the mathematically right answer for longer time horizons. If you have any thoughts on using that money in anything under the 5 to 7 years, it should not go in an investment of anything other than like safe, either bonds, CDs, or savings account where you're protected and you have FDI insurance and all the rest of that jazz. So that's the dollar cost averaging, because it comes down to a behavioral piece. Now on, hold on, getting back to the first question was, student loans emergency fund. There's lots of different thoughts on the emergency fund. Some people are like, you need 6 months of 3 or 6 months of living expenses saved. I mean, you can, at your current incomes, that could take a very, very long time to accrue. And then even if you're going out and transition to attendinghood, you still have expenses and others. Now, you are in healthcare, you have a reasonably secured position. There are reasonable arguments for if you had a move or you had sudden expenses that you probably have the credit ability to be able to take that on credit, or like put it on cards, which is one of the reasons you shouldn't use credit card debt and you should pay them off 100% every month because you have that leeway to use it. And so the emergency funds, you go explore it online, like the financial blogosphere and even some of the academic stuff. There's people that go both ways on that, on both extremes, and they all have reasonable mathematical arguments for it, and it comes down to what you're more comfortable with. So we accrued it slowly over time to the point that I did most of the other investing ahead of that. and then considered the bond or safe portion of my portfolio as the part that I would tap as my quote emergency fund. But then, because statistically you're unlikely to need it, so I considered a low probability event to do it, and that's how I chose to manage it. There's a lot of different ways to do that. If you're highly conservative and that's important to you to have that cash sitting there, then I would accrue that and prioritize it. But understand, I don't know what your student loans are at, but I have a feeling most of them are in the 4 to 6% range, right? Yeah, so that's expensive to sit on when you're like the best you're gonna do on a savings fund, like in a high yield, online bank account is in the 2% range. So you're paying 4% on all that money to have a delay in paying off your student loans. You've got to have a high psychological benefit to sitting on cash to pay that. That's very expensive money that you're sitting on in a savings account. And I encourage you to think about that like that. When I talked about savings, investings, and what you're paying for them, that's one of those things you're paying for to have that. If you're sitting on cash in an account that earns 0.2, 0.5, 1, or 2%, and you have debt that is at negative 4%, that is a terrible arbitrage. Like, how do you think mortgage companies make money? They lend you money at 4 or 5% when they can get the money at 2 or 3%, and they make their money on the difference and the percentages, and they make billions of dollars on that because they have a lot of money that they're lending out. That's how all of those things work. That's how the credit card companies, be the one that the credit card companies are paying to use their card with miles or points, not the one who's paying those, because that's coming from other people paying fees when they don't pay their balances off. Like, if you run a credit card balance, you're putting airline miles in my account. That's how it works. I'm sorry if you didn't think about it that way. I'm not trying to be a dick, but it's, you're not creating free money. That's somebody's paying for it, and it's not Visa or the airlines.
Do you think residents can bank on loan forgiveness?
Oh yeah, student loan forgiveness. You are not a sympathetic constituency, and so far that's a hot mess. I would refer you to either Physician on Fire or the White Coat Investors sites because they break it down a lot more than what I'm going to. My personal risk profile, I had intended to do and started it, but even then, I know that the paperwork, now looking back on it, I know the paperwork wasn't all perfect and it would have been a hot mess, and we just paid them off anyway because we were going to stay and work in academics, but then my wife, who's also a physician, got screwed out of her job, and so we ended up in private practice. So it is what it is. We were going to work for a 403, doesn't matter, nonprofit hospital, 43C. So, life is unpredictable. If you want to do those income-based returns, the repay, pay, or the rest, the problem is things are unpredictable. If your job position changes anywhere in that window and you go from a nonprofit to a for-profit, if any of your paperwork is not perfect, that stuff doesn't go away. Alternatively, understand that you're going to have to keep a side fund because that forgiveness is taxable. So when that stuff, if you are sitting, so right now say you have $400,000 in loans, you go income-based repayment, at the end of this period you have $200,000 in loan. When that $200,000 is forgiven, you know what that shows up on your income tax statement as? Income. It's phantom income, but it's income. And so you owe taxes on that $200,000. You better have saved some money for that. Recognize all these things going forward if you're going to do it. My personal bias is to pay them. However, you need to run that math, and there are actually people and financial advisors who will do that, or consultants, and it usually doesn't cost that much because some of these numbers get complicated, and that decision has to be you, your spouse, and others, and knowing what your debt level is versus what your income level is, what your options are, and what you'd like to know is what that number is. Again, there's a math answer, and then you can decide psychologically or behaviorally whether that works for you. And that's probably some advice that's worth paying for because those calculations are difficult to do because it gets into some probabilities, and they'll be able to tell you whether you've done it right so far and how far down you are on the path. Because if you think you're 5 years in and it's actually screwed up and you're only good for 2, that changes everything. So it's not I would say that is classic government policy right there. It was so damn complex it's almost impossible to administer. Like clinical decision support.